listeners, to another episode of BioLogic Science News. Today I'm going to talk about some rather morbid stuff regarding obesity, diabetes, and the effect that obesity has on the risk for brain abnormalities. This news comes from a study conducted by researchers in Korea, led by Dr. Sunjung Yoon and Dr. In-Kyun Liu, and their partner research teams in the US, led by Han-Byul Cho of the Brain Institute in Salt Lake City, Utah. Their research looked into the health of the brain in people with obesity and an early stage of type 2 diabetes. Their study involved 3 groups: a control group of non-obese people with no diabetes, and 2 experimental groups, both with type 2 diabetes, one composed of obese people and the other with non-obese people. Notice that the study doesn't have a group of obese people without diabetes, so this limits the utility of their final data. By not having this obese control group to compare their results with, it limits the kind of conclusions they can come to. Anyways, it's pretty well understood that obesity can lead to diabetes, and both diabetes and the lifestyle that leads to obesity can cause health problems for the brain. Diabetes involves abnormal sugar regulation and insulin resistance, which is known to have some effect on the brain and may encourage dementia. The mechanism isn't really well understood, but the correlation is certainly there. Furthermore, obesity through a sedentary lifestyle and an unhealthy diet can cause issues with blood pressure and the metabolic system. These factors can also damage the brain, which is critically dependent on the nutrients and energy yielded by basic metabolic processes. Both of these conditions, obesity and diabetes, can lead to Alzheimer's and compromised motor performance. With all this information in mind, the researchers had the study participants engage in a series of psychological tests for things like memory, the speed of deliberate movements, and the capacity for staying alert, maintaining attention, and making decisions. They used MRIs to measure the participants' brains, including the thickness of the gray matter in the cerebral cortex. What they found was that obese people with type 2 diabetes were more likely to show significantly thinner gray matter and less healthy white matter in the cortex around the temporal, occipital, and motor regions than both the non-obese diabetics and the non-obese non-diabetic control group. All of these regions showed significantly more degeneration in people with obesity and diabetes, which was a trend mirrored in the movement speed tests. The degeneration of the temporal lobe is particularly concerning because this is associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease. Taken all together, the researchers' findings suggest that the combined effects of obesity and type 2 diabetes significantly increases the risk factor for the development of brain abnormalities that can potentially lead to diseases like Alzheimer's. This is pretty frightening because Alzheimer's is a terrifying and ultimately fatal disease. It involves the degeneration of the temporal lobe and other parts of the brain through the accumulation of things called amyloid plaques. These build up knots in the neural circuitry, in the brain tissue, and they obstruct proper neuronal signaling. However, it should be understood that the study cannot determine what proportion of the risk is due purely to obesity and that due purely to diabetes, as they didn't have a study group of obese individuals without type 2 diabetes. These are the kinds of fundamental things that scientists have to consider when they're constructing their studies, so that they can come to a meaningful conclusion, as they can't come to a meaningful conclusion by studying just one group. You have to study the other variables in controlled circumstances to see their specific effects and their influence on personal health. The authors of the study conclude their presentation in typical scientific manner by saying that their data encourages greater awareness for the management of type 2 diabetes.